Fortitude or
Welcome back to Fortitude, everyone. J.W. Wilson, your host. Today we have a really special episode for you. A friend of mine's in studio because this month an article is dropping in Texas Observer, one of the better investigative reporting tabloids out there. The story highlights some improprieties in what I would consider a huge scandal cover-up at Texas A&M University's vet school. Considered one of the gold standards in the veterinary world as far as education is concerned. The person to my left, Carolyn Collier, editor of TSU Magazine, Endeavor Magazine, author of a book called The Shining City on the Hill, which I found fantastic, freelance journalist, musician, and gardener. Got them all in there. Thank you for being here, Carolyn. I appreciate it very much. Yeah. The article in question is entitled The Vet, the Cattle Prod, and the Guttural Wail. It came out this month in Texas Observer, like I mentioned, and it's at your hand that this article exists because of a lot of reasons you're about to explain here today. So without further ado, please, if you don't mind, starting from the beginning, how this whole thing came into your purview.
I would have loved to have never discovered this story. I didn't know much about the veterinary world and had good experiences with veterinarians. But in December 2022, my then 9-year-old cat, Dash, started drinking his entire water bowl in one fell swoop, and I realized something was wrong. And he was diagnosed with first diabetes and later acromegaly, which is a lesion on the pituitary tumor that causes many problems, including completely unregulated blood sugar. This was a very difficult time. He was having to get twice daily insulin shots, blood tests. He was a real trooper. And acromegaly can be treatable. I researched every potential medication, every potential surgical treatment, and ultimately decided for him that radiation would be the best course of action. They have such innovative medical technology now, and they can use a technique called stereotactic radiation to target just the pituitary tumor with the correct imaging. And I had planned to take him to North Carolina, but the academic vet at NC State's veterinary school said, no, you should not drive home with this cat after he's had anesthesia multiple times for this treatment. It could be dangerous. Find somewhere closer to home. And she recommended a clinic in Dallas. But I was hoping, it's an extremely expensive treatment. I was hoping to save a little money and asked if she would contact Texas A&M, which is not even 3 hours from my door, you know, more manageable drive. And she called them and said, yes, they do offer stereotactic radiation. So I made an appointment, had to wait almost 2 months.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it was a very difficult time treating poor Dash, who was such a sweet cat. I was, ruling my life. He needed constant care. So I was excited to hopefully save him, get this treated. And I took him down to Texas A&M. It was a multi-day appointment. The first day went really well. They worked him up, and I dropped him off the next morning for an MRI. They were going to do the imaging to determine where the lesion was and come up with a potential radiation treatment plan. He never left that hospital. That day, they said he got kind of sick and insisted on keeping him overnight. And during that night, there were two kind of major medical errors that happened to him. One, his insulin shot was misadministered when he was already kind of in a blood sugar crisis at the time. And then two, the more serious medical error is that someone gave him a new diabetes drug against medical recommendation. Someone with his blood sugar problems or his medical problems should never have had the drug. And the manufacturer, it's a newly approved drug. It's part of the medication instruction. You have to tell the owner about the risk and get their permission. None of this happened. And after he was given this medication, he spiraled into a fatal crisis in a hurry. And they didn't want to tell me, so they were supposed to call me the next morning to do the radiation. I would pick him up, or do the imaging, and I would pick him up, and they didn't call me. And they didn't call me, and I start to panic. I thought, what's happening here? And finally, someone calls me and says, yeah, he's in terrible shape. It's going to cost you another $6,000 or $7,000. We're going to put this central line in. They didn't tell me about any of these medical errors that had been made. And I insisted on coming up right then and talking to someone about what in the world had happened. When I dropped him off, he was purring and happy and had a pretty good night. So finally they admitted to everything that had happened. but wouldn't really admit fault, and in fact tried to tell me that giving this medication to this cat, that the research, academic veterinary research, supported this treatment. And I had already done all my research. I knew that wasn't true, and this was a very dangerous thing to do to him. But they wouldn't admit fault, and worse, they wouldn't let me take him. I wanted to take him to another clinic, and they wouldn't let me see him. So finally they agreed I could see him twice a day for 5 minutes.
Oh my gosh.
Each time, and I'm 3 hours away from home. But I did. I saw him for 5 minutes. That one of the senior clinicians, a faculty member at Texas A&M, stood outside the room with a stopwatch, barged in at 5 minutes flat, and said, "You need to leave." Wouldn't let me take the cat, and he got worse and worse. I made a round trip the next day to spend 2 5-minute sessions with this poor cat. He was not doing well. Yeah, he deteriorated quickly, and he would have died on his own, but we decided to humanely euthanize him. This was on September 16th of 2023.
Right.
So that's my involvement with this story, but
that was just tip of the iceberg for you, right? I mean,
yes.
Obviously a terrible loss, and I'm
Yes.
sorry for the loss, but
Thank you.
then it became much greater.
Yes. So as I see, especially the faculty members at A&M, kind of in a kerfuffle, for lack of a better word, there was something lurking in the air. And instinctually, I knew that there was something very wrong inside Texas A&M. They were all extremely on edge, much more so than the situation warranted, and were in self-protective mode. And it seemed to me like this was somewhat rehearsed. So I could tell instinctually there was something bigger going on, a bigger story. And as I was waiting, next to last time I ever saw Dash, I was waiting in this long, dim waiting room at the Texas A&M Small Animal Teaching Hospital. And I knew instinctually it was as real as this chair I was sitting on, that there was a major scandal and that I was going to tell a story about it. So I'm inside Texas A&M's hospital, Googling Texas A&M veterinary scandal. And of course, immediately it pops up that one of their relatively former, at that point, equine surgeons was facing felony animal cruelty charges for what she had done to a horse at Texas A&M's large animal teaching hospital, which wasn't a surprise. Like, I could already tell something major was happening there.
This lady's name, Ashley Watts, equine surgeon, A&M faculty member, like you said, and I doing some due diligence, Colorado State grad, and Cornell trained, which is one of the other very exclusive vet schools in the country. So she comes from pretty good stock in that world, safe to say, right?
Definitely. Highly accomplished researcher. Well-respected surgeon. She did a lot of surgeries on equine athletes, racehorses, etc., doing kind of musculoskeletal orthopedic surgery for horses.
And what's the story with Ashley Watts, if you mind digging into that? That's a good one.
So this Texas Observer story you've referenced is really all about Ashley Watts. It doesn't even detail what happened to Dash or why I became involved in this story, but Ashley Watts had been accused as far back as 2015 of fatally harming a horse named Dazzle. And I connected with Dazzle's owner. Her name is Heather Katiba, while I was sitting there at Texas A&M. She still to this day doesn't know exactly what happened to Dazzle, who was a 5-month-old filly and was fatally harmed at Texas A&M with severe pelvic trauma. Still don't know exactly what happened, but Heather knew something terrible had happened. She didn't know what, and she suspected strongly that Ashley Watts had done something to this horse.
Carolyn, this horse, Dazzle, comes in mild lameness, from what I remember reading. No real harm, but over a course of a couple days, it's clear that something has transpired major, and the horse is no longer healthy. Fair?
Yeah, in the span of about a week, Dazzle went in with a mild limp, and all of a sudden she really can barely stand.
Right.
She's lost 10% of her body weight. Something terrible has happened to this horse. Still, Heather may never know what exactly happened to Dazzle, but she was certain. She had multiple bad interactions with Dr. Watts at Texas A&M, and was convinced that she had done something wrong to harm the horse, who was eventually euthanized and just couldn't recover. And this set Heather on this long, almost decade-long at this point, quest for accountability and justice. And what she found out is what I soon found out, is that legally, veterinarians in Texas have almost no liability. Your pet is only worth what its replacement market value might be. So if you were going to sell your dog, your 8-year-old dog on Facebook, or buy an 8-year-old dog on Facebook,
Not much value.
$10.
Yep.
A horse is going to be worth a little more, but still not much value. And to hire an attorney to try to, for a civil case, to try to sue for the value of your horse is going to cost exponentially more than the value of this animal. So unless you're willing to shell out your own money, which she eventually was.
And vets, to top that point, veterinary personnel and people at the Texas Institute, like Texas A&M, have further coverage of indiscretion things. To whatever happens, they have a protective wall in front of them at almost every facet, right?
Yes, at least to date. We'll see, there might be future legal challenges ahead. But
Sure.
When Ashley Watts was sued, Texas A&M, actually the state attorney general's office, defended her and Texas A&M at our dime, taxpayers' dime, to defend them. And their legal argument was that Dr. Watts, as an agent of the state, had sovereign immunity, which meant she had no civil liability. And there's a quote in the story that it just didn't matter what she had done. It was just kind of immaterial to the case because she was immune from any liability because she was the state, sovereign, like king or queen, just immune from.
So she could literally try anything if she had an idea, whether it be logical or not. She could try something that she thought might be a good service and not work. She doesn't have to worry about ramifications in that regard.
Not at all. She had no liability, and her employer, Texas A&M, was more than happy to argue this, that there was no case, nothing mattered. And the judge noticed this, and the judge was apparently very angry. I was not there. This was in 2017, 2018, but the court transcript has part of the judge's rant really against Texas A&M for this very reason, saying this is your legal argument, saying your veterinarians can do anything, can cause any harm, and it literally does not matter.
Right.
Which was the legal argument and the one that followed the letter of the law. So that suit was dismissed.
Okay. Then what happens?
So then Heather turns her attention to the Texas State Board of Veterinary Medical Examiners, which is the professional organization that investigates really all complaints of wrongdoing in the veterinary industry and has internal policies for discipline, which can range from a warning, continued education, to permanent revocation of someone's license, although that rarely ever happens. I don't know if you've heard the story of Dr. Lou Tierce here in Fort Worth. He was keeping dogs that had been supposedly euthanized at the end of their life and told the owners that these dogs had been euthanized, but held the dogs captive in his vet clinic and used them as blood donors for other surgeries.
How long ago was this?
Oh, I forget.
Unbelievable.
10 years at least. I know some people who took their pets to him and were horrified. He didn't lose his license. His license was suspended for 5 years, and then he was working, may still be working, at another veterinary clinic in the area as a veterinary technician, but with little to no oversight.
Right.
But even that, which is shocking, just a terrible, unthinkable thing. If that was your pet and you had said goodbye to your pet and thought you had done right by them and found out that they were being tortured, being used in that manner, I would never get over that if that were my pet.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So yeah, so the Texas State Vet Board, which was at the time staffed almost entirely by Texas A&M graduates, was in disarray. So Heather complains to the State Vet Board about Dr. Watts, about what happened to Dazzle, and they dismiss it. They believe what Dr. Watts says. They, this woman doesn't know what she's talking about. I didn't do anything to the horse. So then Heather decides to sue the State Vet Board, which launches an entire series of events. The Austin TV station KXAN has a long, probably 14-part series about the State Vet Board, which was in disarray. They were so behind on their database that you couldn't even search a veterinarian's name or license number and find out if any sort of discipline had been applied.
Right.
They were behind. They weren't properly doing investigations. They weren't effective by any means. I could get into the weeds here, but the Texas Sunset Commission, which is a state body that basically oversees these regulatory agencies. There are many of them, from cosmetology to veterinary industry, too many to name, but they investigated the state board about, their board's being sued at this point. There's this huge backlog. They've paid a contractor 6 figures to redo the website. It never got done.
Fair.
And the Sunset Commission decides that this board is just in complete shambles.
Fair.
And decides to give its oversight over to the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation, which oversees most of the regulatory agencies, whereas previously the vet board had been an independent body staffed by veterinarians, A&M educated veterinarians, largely with no oversight.
Sure.
So now go ahead.
Carolyn, how large is Texas A&M's veterinary school on a site? It's the largest in the country, probably most esteemed, but it's a large institution inside of that bigger institution, right?
It has several thousand employees, and I'm not sure if I know the number of veterinary students that it employs, but until very recently, it was the only vet school in Texas. In fact, Texas A&M's vet school fought for years against Texas Tech's request to start their own vet school. There's a vet shortage in Texas, and I don't know why A&M fought it tooth and nail. Really wanted to be the only possible vet school in Texas. But
nearly any vet you'll run across anywhere around these parts came through Texas A&M, likely, right?
Most of them do. The veterinarian, I have an amazing veterinarian here in Fort Worth, went to Oklahoma State, and I know there are quite a few from LSU, but yes, the majority of veterinarians in Texas went to Texas A&M.
So the dazzle in this first lawsuit, you're discovering all this as you sit there. It doesn't end there with Ashley Watts. It goes on to...
Gosh.
Yes.
Yeah, so she's been under investigation internally at Texas A&M, legally by the board for many years at this point. Plus, as it turns out, she has assaulted a colleague at Texas A&M, also absolved of that internally. So this problem has been building, and she has faced no consequences from anyone, especially from Texas A&M, her employer, the then dean of the vet school. Her name is Eleanor Green. Pretty much given a green light to do whatever she wants, not only treating patients, but in research, which is another aspect of this Texas Observer story. So this comes to a head, coincidentally, a month or two after Texas Tech is allowed to start a new vet school. This is in December 2019. A Houston police officer named Scott Berry brings his horse, named Allie, right before Christmas, to Texas A&M and has a run-in with Dr. Watts. Allie is a big horse. She has a terrible wound on one of her hooves that's covered in maggots. It's so badly infected. Dr. Watts does surgery. Allie's given a large dose of anesthesia, and the surgery, by all accounts, went pretty well, although in a later criminal trial, there's a lot of question about the quality of the overall medical care Allie received. But after surgery, she won't stand up. Dr. Watts leaves the hospital, and a horse has to stand up. Just they have such big limbs. If they don't stand, if they're down for too long, they develop circulatory problems. So horses stand most of the time.
So rising a horse after surgery is paramount in the health of horse. Okay.
Maybe not immediately, but yes, a horse can't be down for too long, or it's not going to recover.
Okay.
And Allie doesn't stand. Her family comes to visit her the night after the surgery. She's still down, but she's happy. She eats some carrots. They feed her hay and carrots, but she never stands. And the hospital staff starts to panic. They know this is turning into an emergency situation for this horse, and they call Dr. Watts. Doesn't want to transfer to the intensive care unit. Allie's situation is getting worse and worse. It turns out she actually has a terrible infection that she wasn't really treated for. It was really the underlying problem. But she won't stand. And by the time Dr. Watts returns to the hospital the next morning, this is a crisis, life or death crisis for this horse.
Okay.
And what happens next is so awful. there's video of the incident. It's extremely traumatic. I've seen the video. I know you've seen segments of the video.
We're going to show it here on the backdrop of the show, and you can search it and find it now. I found it several times. It's the short clip of what you've seen at part of the trial, but it's ghastly.
It's terrible. It's animal torture, which is a heavy word to use, but this is a word used in the legal documents. Wouldn't use it lightly or just...
Right. So what did Dr. Watts do?
So she ordered Allie to be heaved off the ground by a sling-like device, which it turns out wasn't even applied correctly. So the sling is on this horse to lift her up off the ground, and it's not done right, so it's already probably hurting the horse. It's kind of lopsided. And then for reasons unknown, Dr. Watts goes all the way across the hospital to the food animal ward, reaches into a locker and grabs a cattle prod, which is kind of like a taser. It's a device intended to deliver electric shock, substantial electric shock, on a long stick.
Called a hot shot in the article.
Yes.
It's the term for these things called a hot shot, right? Okay.
Yeah, cattle prod, hot shot. Basically kind of a taser on a stick. Even in cattle, the professional guidance is maybe use it once to get a cow to move in the direction you want it to, on the flank, somewhere where it shouldn't hurt the animal too much. And it's not commonly used on horses. I've listened to dozens of hours of testimony, talked to so many people, and most equine veterinarians maybe have used it once in an emergency situation, one time on a horse when there were no other options, needed to be moved to be euthanized, etc. It's not a commonly used thing. 99% of veterinarians seem to agree, but she goes and fetches it. And this horse is suspended above the ground, kind of twisting and turning. And for the next half an hour plus, while there are students observing her, she proceeds to shock this poor horse all over her body, in her eye, on her ear, under her tail, in extremely sensitive areas. She's poking this horse, not always shocking her, but often shocking her. And the suffering this poor Allie went through, you can just see her torment. That's the Guttural Wail. You mentioned the name of the story. One of the then students described in a state hearing that was the sound. Those were the sounds that Allie was making as she was being tortured. And eventually she kind of gives up, and she's just trying to get away from Dr. Watts, but she can't go anywhere. She's suspended above the ground, and she's so sick she can't stand anyway. And Dr. Watts later says she was trying to save this horse's life by shocking her. There's no way to know how many of the pokes were actual shocks, but the horse was poked with this long metal stick over 1,000 times, and many of those times she was also being shocked with significant electrical current. I mean, just looking at Allie's reaction, you can tell she's terrified. She's in a lot of pain.
And the part of the story that there's so much to focus on, but one of the parts is in her report, she claims that she called Scott Berry,
Yes.
Scott Berry, to ask permission to do this.
Yes.
And of course he denies it. He never heard a word from her.
No.
She just did this on her own accord. So again, she did this terrible thing, and then she tries to say that she took the right steps, and obviously there begins the cover up or the improprieties. So yeah. I think maybe she did call him. She took a break in the middle of the hot shotting and disappears from the video for about 8 minutes. And I think she may have called him, but he's adamant, and I believe him 100%, that there was never any discussion about a hot shot. He loved his horse. Yeah.
He said under oath, if he had had to sell his house to have enough money to get her the treatment that she needed to save her life, he would have done it. He loved, compared the horse to any other member of his family. Which has someone who loves their own pets.
Yep. How did it end for Allie?
So after being shocked for 30 minutes, Allie was finally let off the sling, lowered back to the ground. She was kind of trembling, and less than an hour later, she was dead. It turns out she was septic. She was just raging with infection, which wasn't diagnosed and wasn't treated correctly. And that had been known even before the surgery, she might have been able to be treated.
Sure.
Potentially could still be living today.
Mm-hmm.
But all of that hot shotting,
Mm-hmm.
all of that suffering she went through wasn't ever going to make a difference. So at the very end of her life, she was tortured.
The students that are with Dr. Watts, are they is this considered a teaching moment for these kids? Is that what was intended, or did Dr. Watts want these people to see her doing this? Did she care? Was there any thought behind why these students were there watching this, and then ultimately the end result not going well? How did Dr. Watts behave after the fact?
So yeah, there were at least 2 students, maybe more, observing her that week. It was part of an orthopedic surgery rotation for students, veterinary students in their final year of vet med education.
Mm-hmm.
And according to testimony, she never said what she was doing with the hot shot. She never explained. So they were sitting there just kind of watching her do this,
Right.
in shock and in horror. There's testimony about people kind of pacing the hallway, and this horse is screaming in pain.
Mm-hmm.
And there's their faculty member who holds all the power in this situation, ruin their education,
Mm-hmm.
harming this horse in front of everybody with no explanation.
But luckily there was a person in the mix, a vet tech,
Yes.
the angel in
Yes.
the scene.
Yes. Yes, so actually the vet tech in question was not there at the time. There's a vet tech named Julie Baker, who was working at the Texas A&M Large Animal Hospital at the time. She had been there the night before when Allie wouldn't stand.
Mm-hmm.
Was one of the people who raised the alarm that this horse, something wrong with this horse, we need to move her, we need to treat her. And she came back a few hours after Allie had died, and has testified multiple times about the somber mood inside the hospital. And people had been crying. Everybody who was there was extremely disturbed, in their own shock, upset. Now, nobody gets into the veterinary industry to watch an animal suffer like that. I think people were genuinely very upset. And so she gets back, and people are kind of whispering, crying. It's a very dark mood has overtaken the hospital. And people are talking about the video. Watch the video. There are cameras all over Texas A&M's both teaching hospitals. There's a large animal for horses and cattle and a small animal for cats and dogs mostly. And every room I went in had a video camera.
Right.
They're everywhere. They record everything. And of course there was one in Allie's stall that captured this entire incident. And so Julie, first thing she does is file an internal complaint. Texas A&M's ethics point about what had happened. And she testified that she was told that nothing was going to happen to Dr. Watts, which it turns out is what the internal investigation decided upon, that this was perfectly fine that she had done this. But Julie Baker said a few cryptic things during a later hearing about previous incidents where Texas A&M likes to smooth things up and cover them over.
Right.
I don't know what she was referring to, but she was worried enough that what happened to Allie would kind of be buried. Never come to light. So she decided to download the video of what Dr. Watts did to Allie and leave the hospital with it. And she delivered that video to the state board, which by that point had been completely reshuffled. It had new members. It had oversight from this, different regulatory agency. Didn't have so much autonomy. And so for the second time in 4 years, the board had a very serious complaint against Ashley Watts.
And had Julie Baker not taken that video, thinking future, we might not be sitting here having this talk, and you might not have the ability to write this story, because the evidence is so damning in her case, and rightfully so.
Yeah. I mean, if Julie Baker had not done what she had done, and she deserves so much applause. She's the real heroine in this entire situation. She didn't have a lot of power as a veterinary technician. She assumed a lot of professional risk for doing this, but if she had not done what was right and given this evidence to the only people who could have possibly, well, it's not true, the only people who were likely to seek some accountability, Dr. Watts would probably still be working for Texas A&M. still be treating animals, because as it turns out, that internal complaint, which was filed, it was investigated by three other equine veterinarians, led by one named Susan Eads, and they talked to the people who were present. They talked to Dr. Watts and basically said, no, this wasn't torture. This was veterinary treatment. She wasn't acting out of rage. She was just trying to save the horse. They thought it was more serious that she had not told the observing students what she was doing. So the internal recommendation for how to handle this is not the first complaint against Ashley Watts. There are multiple over the years, but their internal recommendation was in her performance review, the next one, that she would get an unsatisfactory in patient care and a needs improvement in teaching. She was tenured, so this wasn't really going to affect her job standing. She was kind of immune from that sort of thing. And as it turns out, those things didn't even happen. She was not even, her next professional review didn't have any unsatisfactory or needs improvement. In fact, she was given a raise.
Okay.
So if Julie Baker had not taken that video and delivered it elsewhere, that would have been the end of it. And in fact, even after this investigation, after this video was dissected internally, the social media accounts for the Texas A&M College of Veterinary Medicine were making posts asking people to bring their equine athletes, probably valuable racehorses, to Ashley Watts for this stem cell research she was doing to heal chronic injuries.
Oh, interesting.
This was 2 years after what happened to Allie. They were still actively asking horse owners to bring their animals to Dr. Watts.
Sure, and why not, right? It's
super trustworthy.
I uncovered a TikTok video of a lady describing this situation you're describing in detail, but the video in question has no audio. It's just strictly video. But there is a rumored that story that Ashley Watts was overheard yelling at the horse, "Get up! The lions are coming." Have you heard this thing?
I've heard this story, yes.
The lions are coming. Obviously, she's trying to motivate the animal with voice and other things, the cattle prod, but the lions are coming, saying this to a horse in front of these people, which I didn't know if that was true or not, and it sounds like it was.
Yes, so. I've heard this from several people at this point, so yes.
So how did it proceed after all these things happened? What was the next course of events?
So the next thing, the state board did spring into action. They had new investigators that hadn't been working for the board during the investigation about what happened to Dazzle. So they had some, by all accounts, wonderful new investigators who took this very seriously. They had video evidence. So they spring into action. They start interviewing. I know they interviewed Scott Berry and I'm sure other people about what had happened in the months following this. Dr. Watts doesn't know this. Texas A&M doesn't know this, that this investigation is ramping up in a hurry. And this is, of course, at this point in early 2020. Scott Berry didn't even know, he didn't know about the hot shot. He didn't know what had happened to Allie at the end because what Dr. Watts had shared with him was very cryptic. So he found out about the hot shot and about the torture through an investigator with the Texas State Board of Veterinary Medical Examiners, called him and said, "I hate to break it to you, but I need to tell you what happened to your horse at the end." And as Mr. Berry has relayed to me, every time he heard more about this incident, it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. And
Scott was a Houston police officer, right? Still is.
Very nice man, wonderful person. Cared deeply about his animal, and he and his family are very traumatized about what happened, as anybody would be.
Absolutely.
Yes, so the board starts investigating. I guess Dr. Watts gets wind of it, and apparently changed something in Allie's medical record right before the state board got those medical records. And she did something very strange. She offered to Mr. Berry that he could come up to Texas A&M and watch the video with her. Which you've seen the video. I don't know what in the world possessed her to do that, or what she thought was going to, how that would have gone.
Yeah, you can't explain your way out of that one. There's no chance of that.
I mean, she tried.
She tried, yeah. Wow.
So at this point, it's March 2020, and that meeting never happened because the world shut down.
So Scott files a lawsuit, right?
No.
No. and then it Ashley's on notice now, right? From the outside community, the medical observer board, right?
So she realizes at some point in 2020 that another investigation against her is happening. But this is not the first time this has happened to her, and she has the precedent of looking back and said, well, they absolved me last time. This was, I had no liability. I don't know if she thought this would be no different.
Not too concerned.
I don't know. I mean, I've never spoken to Ashley Watts, so I don't know what her state of mind was, but and anything that happened after that, she has continued to defend herself and from all indications believes she did the right thing by the horse and was truly acting in the horse's best interest.
Right.
She is one of the only people who seems to believe that.
Fair.
Especially given the events that follow. So the state board does, I think in 2021, they issue an emergency suspension of her license so she can no longer treat animals. And I think the exact wording that she was an imminent threat to public welfare. So that she could not treat animals, which Texas A&M was more than happy to allow her to keep treating people's pets. And then that was rescinded. And in the midst of all of this, the district attorney in Brazos County, where Texas A&M is, gets a copy of the video. Also horrified, something that A&M's College of Veterinary Medicine thinks is no big deal. The district attorney thinks is felony animal cruelty and charges her. And only then, after she's charged with a felony for what she did at his hospital, does Texas A&M suspend her.
Unbelievable.
I know. If I had known this, I would not have taken my cat there. If I had known this institutional acceptance of animal torture was the norm,
right,
I wouldn't have stepped foot in that building.
Yes. And then this is another on top of all that. It still doesn't stop. And I don't know if I'm reading too much into this part of the story, but it's clear that it happened. But Dr. Ashley Watts was performing stem cell therapies on hundreds of horses and other horses, I believe.
Yes, horses.
In stem cell therapies, what I know, they have to be FDA approved at some level to be used in therapies or treatments. She was doing this without FDA approval and or owner of the horse approval on her own accord.
Yes.
Doing these stem cell therapies. Please tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so this is the research component. Dr. Watts was an exceptionally accomplished researcher. She had published more than 40 peer-reviewed papers. She was an editor at a pretty prominent academic journal. She'd been doing research since she was at Cornell about regenerative medicine, which is all about stem cells and how there are multiple potential therapeutic uses, whether that's making injuries heal more quickly. Coincidentally, there's at least some suggestion it can help treat or potentially even cure diabetes, but stem cells are still uncertain. There's still some risk. It's not proven. And the FDA, which has oversight over animal drugs, they're very clear. Stem cells can only be used on animals for investigational purposes, and there are a lot of hoops to jump through, a lot of protocols to do research on living animals. A lot of proposals to draw up protocols for animal well-being, and one of the bodies that has to know the details of the research and improve it is called an IACUC. It's the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee that any university that hosts research on live animals has this body, and they're usually very strict, and they have to oversee and approve. And of course, Dr. Watts had not even asked Texas A&M's internal body about doing this research. She didn't have any FDA approval, but she was working on a patent. She had come up with a new way to grow stem cells. Normally they were using cow serum, so you'd extract stem cells from, say, a horse, and use cow serum to grow them kind of in a petri dish to have enough to then re-inject. But she had developed a way to use the horse's own serum to do it, which would potentially decrease any complications or rejection of the stem cells, and had submitted an application for a patent at this time. When the incident with Allie had happened. But yeah, she had a grant funded by the American Quarter Horse Association. It's a huge, highly important international group of horse owners,
Right.
working on stem cell medicine, which could feed off your racehorses. If this ends up working out in the future, this could be hugely important to equine athletes, who might get injuries that can be hard to treat. And if stem cells potentially might be helpful, this could be a very big deal to horses and their owners. But the evidence isn't set. This is not approved yet because there are risks.
A&M has since, according to the article that you put together, has since killed that research segment, and from what I gather, and reimbursed many of the owners for housing, treatment, because of this coming to light, correct? Her involvement with stem cell research became a thing, aside from her other stuff, and then A&M got wind of it and quickly dropped the cover up, right? More or less?
I think it's a little more complicated. I mentioned earlier about the social media accounts asking for owners of equine athletes to bring their horses in for treatment. It was part of this research. This research she was doing, funded by the American Quarter Horse Association. She was treating, I forget the exact number, a couple hundred horses, and the owners prepaid for treatment, but they weren't fully informed that A, this was completely investigational, B, that there were risks. And not only that, she was making these stem cell therapies and then giving them to other veterinarians to treat the horses with, all of this with no approval. Just kind of making her own rules.
May I ask an obvious question? Ashley Watts is one of many professors, faculty at Texas A&M Vet School. Is it a safe guess that surely there's many good veterinarians and people at Texas A&M Vet School, but
certainly
it was a standard reason that Ashley's not the only one that's involved in some of these things, because there's so much going on. It's such a large beast, no pun intended, but this A&M is their goal obviously is students in money, education, things like that, but they do whatever they can to cover up something like this or keep it quashed down, because any bad news prohibits new students, money coming in, research grants, things like that. But there must be others that, or this is the obvious question. We don't know, but
it
stands to reason.
Excellent question, JW.
Okay.
I'm glad you're asking that question.
Good.
I'm also asking that question, and I know I'm not the only one. You think this would be a good subject of another story?
I think it would, for sure.
Yeah.
This article comes out this month, and it is going to blow the wheels off a lot of things, as it should, for all the right reasons. And luckily, you had your hand behind it, and amongst others. Yeah, and I know. Have you? And we'll continue the story in a second. But have you had any pushback from you publishing the article, doing the due diligence you've done? Has anybody come to you or said anything or tried to stop you in any way along the path? Can you speak to that?
I want to be careful what I say about the pushback. Yes, I think it's safe to assume that protecting the brand was an important objective.
Sure.
Understandably, any large wealthy institution doesn't want to suffer a reputational hit, whether it's deserved or not. Texas A&M would not be unique in that.
Fair.
Yes, so I may leave that answer a little cryptic.
I can appreciate that.
This story has come to light. It took a lot of perseverance. It took a year. It took hundreds of hours of interviews. I think I had, in the end, 150,000 words worth of notes that got condensed into a 4,000 word story. Easily could be a book and may still be a book, just because there's so much more to the story than what's in the Texas Observer story. It's sprawling and really should terrify people who love their animals across the state.
There's no doubt. And then you have attended the trial of Dr. Ashley Watts.
Yes.
Not too recently, it concluded with the sentencing's coming up December 6th. Tell us about the trial, what you can.
Before we get to the felony trial, I do want to mention that the state vet board did recommend permanent revocation of Dr. Watts' license, which necessitated first a 3-day hearing at a state court called the State Office of Administrative Hearings. Any contested action like revoking a doctor or veterinarian's license, they have the right to what for all intents and purposes is a trial. And the vet board did end up revoking Dr. Watts' Watts's license that was finalized earlier this year. And then her felony animal cruelty trial started in September at the Brazos County Courthouse in Bryan, Texas. It was an 8-day trial, and yes, I was able to get down there for 4 of the 8 days, and was really glad I was able to do that. I got to meet Scott Berry, who I'd talked to many times on the phone. I got to meet him in person, which was great. Heather Katiba, Dazzle's owner, was there for every second of it.
Dazzle has a Facebook page for Dazzle.
Yes, for Dazzle.
Gotten a lot of attraction because of all this.
Yes, if you're interested more, I would suggest that's the first place to go. Yes, Heather knows more about vet med law, veterinary ethics than probably anyone else in the world at this point, so that's a great resource.
Did A&M publicly come out with a reprimand of Dr. Ashley Watts? Did they suspend her without pay, fire her? How did A&M sever ties with Ashley Watts?
Oh, that was, yeah, so she was suspended. I don't remember if she was suspended with or without pay, but she was suspended.
I'll help you with pay.
With pay.
Yes.
She was suspended after the felony charges, and then there was an internal investigation that cited the unapproved stem cell research and also unauthorized manufacturing and distribution of a pharmaceutical by giving other veterinarians these stem cells. And so they recommended, after she was charged with the felony, that she be terminated. But instead of actually terminating her, they allowed her to resign, and she was given $50,000 from Texas A&M.
Oh, severance.
Severance.
How appropriate. That makes a lot of sense.
From an institution funded by the state.
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
taxpayer dollars.
Yeah.
Fair?
I don't want to get into A&M's internal accounting,
Sure.
so I don't know if it's directly from our money or. But yeah, she was given a sizable chunk. But all of a sudden, things are looking very bad for Dr. Watts. She's lost her job. She's lost her license and is now facing a felony.
Right.
Which is pretty unheard of. I'm certainly not aware of any other academic veterinarians, professors, that are facing felonies for what they did in front of students inside of a university teaching hospital to someone's pet. I'm not aware of anything similar happening ever. Pretty major scandal in my eyes.
Could we ask about Dr. Watts's attorney? She has a prominent attorney defending her. What is the defense for someone like this? Is it just obvious? Hey, you don't know how this world works. This is usually how it's supposed to go, type of thing. Her behavior was appropriate to get the horse to stand. This was more or less the defense.
Yeah. So she had 2 different defense attorneys. One who's another resident of Fort Worth, like we are, during the administrative trial over her license, and then a criminal defense attorney in Bryan, Texas. Yes, the defense was pretty much the same both times. They had multiple other academic veterinarians who work at other vet schools around the country fly in and testify that yes, this is normal in equine surgery. This is maybe not a commonly used technique, but yes, that other veterinarians post-surgery, if it calls for it, would shock a horse repeatedly. Mind you, she shocked Allie in the eye.
I'm guessing you don't agree with that statement that what these experts say this is a common thing, or it's not common, but it does happen. You don't agree with that, I'm guessing, right?
I certainly don't agree with it. In fact, they are the only group of people, maybe 5 to 10 people on this entire planet, who seem to agree that this is okay
interesting.
And normal.
They may have been motivated to say certain things, but who knows?
I don't know.
Who are we to say?
I don't
Gotcha.
know. But it was. I don't want to use the word shocking given the circumstances, but I think everyone in the courtroom, many people in the courtroom were appalled that someone was willing to fly in from Cornell in New York and testify that yes, she would have learned to do this at Cornell and this is normal and she's innocent of animal cruelty because this is normal post-surgical behavior.
Describe the trial for us if you can briefly.
The trial was fascinating. I'd never sat in a felony criminal trial before. It was really interesting, and the district attorneys in Brazos County deserve so much applause. They really did Allie justice. They really did Scott Berry, and I guess by extension, Dazzle and Heather Katiba justice. They went to the end of the earth to make the case that this was animal cruelty. They had multiple witnesses who were there, including Julie Baker, including one of the vet students, who's now a veterinarian in Waco, who was observed at the time, observed the incident, testified for the state. They had multiple equine surgeons from other veterinary schools testifying that no, this is not normal behavior. This was poor quality of treatment for the horse. This is not normal. They had other equine veterinarians from around Texas come and say, no, we don't do this to our horses. This is animal cruelty. And the closing arguments on the final day were really brilliant. They were very emotional. One of the district attorneys had a hot shot, which is probably about as tall as I am. She was, stamping it on the ground, showing that in the video, the hot shot's bending as Dr. Watts hits Allie. As she's hitting the hot shot on the ground, it's hard to bend it. This is a piece of metal. Shows how forceful Dr. Watts was with the horse. And they had, I thought this was a nice touch. They had a picture of I don't know the name of the statue on Wall Street, the girl defiantly looking at the bulls. They flashed that on the screen in reference to Julie Baker, saying, somebody displayed ethics here. It was the people without power that in the end.
Good for her.
Yeah.
Good for her.
The world needs more people like her.
There's no doubt.
Yes.
Have any other cases arisen because of the spotlight now on Texas A&M Vet School? Any other stuff coming to light that you know of?
Criminal cases?
Any cases for that matter. I mean, now that there's been an opening in this wall, this protective wall that they have, is surely there's more incidents than just the ones that you know of, I would think.
Oh, I'm sure, and yes, inbox is open to hear more. But yes, I do know of a few more involving different animals. They're cases that I couldn't cite in the story because the owners of the animals, they're still waiting on the vet board to come down with a decision. It's going to be an extremely time-consuming process. I mean, this is 5 years ago now, what happened to Ellie. Just now being resolved 5 years later. So yeah, there are other cases, and by cases, I don't know of any other criminal cases. That took something extreme, not just veterinary malpractice, but something extreme to become felony animal cruelty. Civil cases, trying to sue for the value of your pet is kind of pointless. I know there's at least one other person that's going to try and kind of challenge the legal loophole for sovereign immunity. So we'll see. Stay tuned on that. As far as complaints to the vet board about other Texas A&M veterinarians, yes, there are some ongoing, and there will be at least one more in the near future, which will be my complaint about what happened to Dash.
Good. What is Dr. Ashley Watts? What is she facing at sentencing? What are her potential?
So after the closing arguments, which were brilliant, this is 8 days of testimony. Nobody knew how long the jury would deliberate. They had a lot of evidence to go through, a lot of conflicting viewpoints. It could have been days or a week or more of arguing back and forth. Is this Texas A&M vet guilty of felony animal cruelty? Oh no, it took less than an hour that included lunch that the judge bought the jury. And in less than an hour, they were backed with the unanimously guilty verdict. And so Dr. Watts has now been convicted of a state jail felony. She has no prior convictions, so we'll see. I have no idea what criminal penalty she's going to face. There's a possibility she could go to prison. Probably more likely she'll get probation. The judge is going to make that determination.
Sure.
In December.
But time there should be some time served for this case, right?
It might be probation.
Probation.
I don't know if she'll go to prison or not, since she has no previous convictions.
Right.
I'm guessing that's unlikely, but I don't know. But she can never practice veterinary medicine again. Someone convicted of a felony is automatically stripped of their license permanently.
Kind of makes sense, yes.
You would think, especially animal cruelty, you would think, and hopefully enough people will hear this story that apparently she still runs a boarding facility for horses in Bryan, Texas.
Oh, good.
Would you let your pet stay with her?
I don't think that would be a good option for me.
No.
If I had a horse, right?
No, I wouldn't hire her to cat sit. That's for sure.
What am I forgetting to ask you about? There's so much that is involved in everything you told us. Is there anything that we need to ask? You need to tell us that's on top of what we already know?
Oh gosh. like I said, this could easily be a book, so we've probably skipped over quite a bit. I do want to applaud the state vet board,
Good.
which has been through a lot of reorganization, a lot of scrutiny.
Good. We'll tag them in the video or the episode. That'll be helpful. So
Yes, and I hope when it comes to the complaint I'm going to file, I do, wish them the best handling it. It's obviously a very different situation. What happened to me and what happened to Dash. Not going to be any criminal trials, and I do hope they handle it ethically, fairly for all involved. And
yes,
stay tuned for that story.
we would like to follow up on you with that case because that's a
Yes.
meaningful thing as well. And
Yeah.
Dash's life, sad as it is, it made this whole thing come to light for you. So if there's a silver lining in all this, right? It had to be sweet Dash going through this situation. So, Carolyn, what do you hope comes from all this? What's your overarching goal with publishing this piece?
I would love to see some serious policy changes in animal welfare law. I think, human-animal relationships have evolved so much, and the law does not reflect that. The Texas law that considers animals property worth no more than their replacement value is very old. I believe it dates back to the 1800s. And things have evolved considerably. Like, I think my pets are worth a lot more than, $5-10. They're
Absolutely.
members of my family. So I would like to see the laws updated. I would like to see animals have more rights in general, beyond just the veterinary industry. It's a complicated when it comes to veterinary liability. It's already expensive. It's getting more expensive to seek veterinary care. There aren't enough vets. It's a very, very difficult job. So there's not an easy answer about changing laws about liability. There's a lot to consider, but I hope it does get considered.
Sure.
And as just another thing I hope that happens as a result of this, I hope just humanity in general takes animals into better consideration. The next to last day of the trial, I was driving back from Bryan, about a 3-hour drive back here to Fort Worth, and on one of the small 2-lane highways, I passed a truck with chickens crammed into these probably, 4 or 5 inch tall cells. And it looked like the chickens weren't alive, which was horrific enough. But then I saw some moving and I realized that no, these are food chickens.
Sure.
And these just unspeakably awful conditions. And I'm just driving back from this felony animal cruelty trial for what happened to one horse, but yet this is normal. This is just open on the highway, and
Surely.
these chickens are obviously suffering. I suspect future generations are going to look back on how our society has treated animals,
No doubt.
especially in the food animal industry,
No
and
doubt.
they're going to be a little judgmental in the ways that our generations are extremely judgmental about things that happened in the past. Like
Right.
the institution of slavery seems unthinkable now. And I hope at some point humanity comes to a reckoning
Good.
about how we treat animals.
Yep.
And this is kind of all one part of it's part of a larger story about animals' dignity, animals' rights, their inherent worth, their uniqueness just as living beings.
Yep.
Like you have had pets that you love. They're all different. They have a lot of just inherent worth. They're individuals with wants, needs, personalities. They're not replaceable.
Sure.
So I hope this sparks a lot of self-examination on
Good.
a societal level.
Good. I've heard you say the term or the phrase, someone needs to vet the vets.
Yeah.
And that's about as appropriate as I think it can get, because there's thousands of wonderful vets in this
Yes,
world, in this
absolutely.
country, the city, all the places.
Absolutely.
But oftentimes when things get so big that things get pushed under the rug, and you've brought to light a pretty good example of something that needs to be changed.
Yeah.
Would you speak to the veterinarian situation as far as suicide? I read that part, and that's incredibly sad.
It is. It is incredibly sad. Veterinarians, especially female veterinarians, are at increased risk for suicide. I think it's in general 1.6 to 2.4 times more likely than the general population to fall victim to suicide, which is very sad. And I'm sure it's an incredibly hard job. Not only do animals not live that long, and it's hard to treat them, they can't tell you what's wrong. I'm sure dealing with people, emotional people on top of that can be very difficult. but it also, a key component of the crisis in veterinary suicide is that there's very little regulation. This all goes back to the lack of regulation, lack of oversight. In human medicine, strong, potentially lethal drugs are carefully regulated. If you go to the hospital and you're getting pain medication, like each dose is logged in the computer. But these same prescription pain medicines, euthanasia medicines, are not regulated in vet med. And the FDA, writing about the veterinary suicide crisis, found that the most likely cause of suicide or method of suicide was overdose by pentobarbital, which is the most common euthanasia medicine, largely unregulated, and it's used recreationally as a barbiturate.
People are using this to
get high, I would assume.
I'll be damned.
And overdoing it, I don't know, it's hard to say without getting into someone's mind.
Sure.
I have no doubt this is an extremely difficult job, much more difficult than my job, but my job does not offer unfettered access to very strong psychoactive chemicals that could potentially be fatal when taken.
Understood.
Too much.
Carolyn Collier, thank you for being here and sharing this. How can people find this story?
At the Texas Observer. Just Google Texas Observer. It's one of the main stories in their December 2024 issue. And thank you to the Texas Observer. It's doing amazing work, muckraking, investigative journalism, which there's very little of appearing anywhere anymore. It's very difficult, very time-consuming, not very profitable work. And so I'm eternally thankful to them for partnering with me and allowing me to tell the story and working with me on fact-checking, citing legal documents, court cases, etc. So yeah, Texas Observer, please go check it out. Support them.
Thank you for being here and sharing your story, and thank you for being a friend of the animal kingdom, and not just taking someone's word for what happened. You decided to follow up, and look what it did. Great job.
Thank you. Thank you, Toby. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate your time and your interest in this story.
Sure. That's been another episode of FORTitude. Thanks for joining us.
FORTitude or